And I'll pass over to Roy, who's going to chair tonight and introduce tonight's talk. Roy's just getting his slides up here. That's Roy, but your microphone's on mute.
Okay, that should be okay.
That's you.
You are screen sharing. Great. Well, good evening, everybody. It gives me great pleasure to introduce you to tonight's speaker, Alistair Whyte, who is currently the head of Plantlife in Scotland. Now, many of you will not need an introduction, because if you run your eye down the list of things that he's done in his career in wildlife conservation, you'll see that he spent 5 years as our local SWT conservation manager between 2007 and 2012. And part of his responsibilities there was to look after our local reserves. Now, while we wait for the latecomers and for the IT issues to be resolved, I thought I would briefly show you some of the local projects with which Alistair was associated and outline how they've been progressing, both for his and your information. Right. It's not moving. Oh, there we go. Yeah, sorry, it was just slow. Okay, well, one of the first projects that he got us involved with, and this was over the whole of his area, that he wanted people who were next to reserves, which were meadows, to monitor the plants there so that they could change the grazing regimes and optimize them. And we took on Beaumains Meadow, which is Scotland's smallest SSSI. And we've done annual surveys of greater butterfly orchids, which you can see on the left. And what we do is to map them. And the little red dots on that diagram show you every fourth plant. So if you go back to 2007, which was the year when we were asked to do this, you can see there are 802 greater butterfly orchids. And if you look down in the bottom right-hand corner, you'll see that the last year were 964. So that's pretty stable, and that's very good actually for a meadow of this type. We've got some meadows with only 10 plants on them, for instance. Okay, now when Alistair took over this reserve, we noticed two peculiar plants came in, both normally associated with northern England, and we thought that they were brought in by the sheep which grazed the meadow. Now this is Betony that you can see there, the purple plant. And if you look at the map of its distribution, you'll see the black dots virtually cover England almost precisely up to the border. And then there's virtually no black dots in Scotland. Well, our meadow was a new site for this. And since Alistair left, the colony's gradually enlarged. And actually, we've now got a white sort of subspecies growing on the meadow. Now, another thing which local people will be familiar with that Alistair had a lot to do with was the management plan for our reserve at Cambus Pools, which is at the junction of the Forth and the River Devon. It's probably changed beyond recognition from the time that Alistair was there. For instance, the track and the seats and the maps and all these things have been put in since Alistair's time. But Alistair it was who drew up the management plan to try and increase the numbers of plants and the numbers of birds that were nesting on the reserve. And both have gone up massively. So here, this shows you the number of species that there were in 1993 when Bill Brackenridge did a count. He was a very good botanist. I'm sure he wouldn't have missed any. And you can see in the table at the bottom, there were 104 species. By 2008, we'd worked on the reserve, and Alistair himself did a survey, and there were 132 species in that year. And 2 years ago, we did another survey and it's got to 164. So the management plan, we were trying to increase the numbers of plants. We've certainly done that. Now, they come from two places. Some have just come in naturally. And when Alistair was there, we had one orchid, and now we've got 4 species of orchids. And 2 which have just come in naturally are the tway blade, which is the plant on the left, and the broadleaf telebrine on the right. And we have probably 100 of those plants on the reserve now. Another thing we've done is to try and introduce plants ourselves. Now, we found that one plant which was present in the original count was maiden pink, which is really rare. You see the maiden pink plant on the left of these two, and this disappeared. And so we grew it up from seed and we planted it out. And after 3 years, we've still got some on the reserve. I can't say it looks particularly happy, but it's still there. Now, just down the river from Cambus Pools, down the River Forth, there's an island, and Alistair manfully took us over there. It's a pretty scary place, actually, because once you drop down from the bank, the reeds are completely over your head, so you can't see much except reeds. But I guess we haven't done much management there. The management is really to leave it alone. Now, when Alistair was with us, we got indications that marsh harriers might nest there. And the indications came from some birds which had tags fitted to them in the Tay estuary where they nested. And they came when they were going south and migrating. They stopped over this island for 2 weeks on 2 consecutive years. Well, since then, they've started to stay much longer. And in the last 3 years, we've had marsh harriers nesting on the island. In fact, there were 2 nests on the island this last year, which is an astounding result. Down the river farther is the bigger island of Alloa Inch, and we used to have some really scary journeys across there with Alistair. You see that little white boat? Well, we used to go across when the tide was coming down, and you get whirlpools almost as big as the boat. Anyway, and this particular trip, we were trying to mend the bank, and behind Roger Gooch, you can see in yellow there, you can see the true height of the bank which surrounds the island and keeps the spring tides out. And clearly in front of it, there's a gap where the water would stream through. And we were putting in these posts, which you can see behind Alistair, to try and stabilize the bank. Well, I went down on Sunday to see if they're still there, and they are miraculously still there. Unfortunately, the bank the other side of Roger, that was obviously much higher, that has been slowly washed away. So the highest point now is where we put the poles in. Oh. Well, the last shot I thought I would show you is of Alloa Inch, just to show you that we've got some plants to be proud of on our patch. And this is Alloa Inch in the spring. And what you see there is about a quarter of the island, and it's covered with scurvy grass, which is all those white flowers. And there's much, much more of it than is shown in this picture. It's absolutely amazing. And I think that I've been to a lot of reserves in Scotland, and I think, as far as I'm concerned, this is Scotland's most impressive floral spectacle. And if any of you can think of somewhere which you put higher up the scale than this, please will you put it in your chat column. Well, there's just a glimpse of some of the things that Alistair did for us. I'm now going to turn the meeting over to him. His title is Scotland's Important Plant Areas, Restoring Wild Plant Diversity. So Alistair, over to you.
Thanks very much, Roy, and thank you for that introduction and that trip down memory lane. It's really nice to see those reserves and how they're progressing, how they're coming on. Really good to hear, and it's reminded me I'll have to go and revisit some of those sites and see what's happening there for myself. I'd got great memories of my time with Scottish Wildlife Trust in your area, and yeah, some of the sites are just incredible for wild plants. Can I check that that is showing okay?
Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, well, thanks very much for inviting me along this evening. Really happy to be here. Folks, wild plants, and I know I'm kind of preaching to the converted here, but I always think it's worth saying again, wild plants are the foundation of all ecosystems. They're essentially the scaffolding on which everything else is built. You know, without any plants, we wouldn't have any life. It's as simple as that. Plants convert sunlight into energy, and then they make that energy available for virtually every other living thing on the planet. And the diversity of plants underpins the diversity of all other life, which makes the world's ecosystems so rich and so extraordinary. And that's really, really exemplified by this shot of the Machair here out on Scotland's west coast. So hugely, hugely important. But that diversity is under threat. So last year, the latest State of Nature report, which is essentially a kind of audit of how well wildlife is faring across the UK, was published. And you won't be surprised to hear things aren't looking good. So across all the species groups, across all the taxa groups, 1 in 9 Scottish species are at risk of being lost. And we're seeing massive declines in plants and lichen populations. And this picture is reflected globally. And it's our job to try and turn this around. And there are lots of different ways of doing this. One of the most effective ways that we use, that Plantlife uses, is to focus on plant diversity hotspots, where plant populations, I suppose, still show some of their natural diversity and some of their natural richness. The idea being that if we can protect and restore those populations, then we can expand them, we can join them up, we can create vibrant ecological networks. So that's what the Important Plant Area Programme tries to do. Plantlife leads on the IPA programme, and you can see here an indication, and you probably won't be able to see this map in a huge amount of detail, but you can see the spread of important plant areas in Scotland. And we'll come back to that map. So important plant areas are internationally adopted. It's an internationally adopted system of identifying and protecting the most important places in the world for plant diversity. They're selected using 3 very well thought through and very robust criteria. Threatened species being the first one, exceptional botanical richness and threatened habitats. And every IPA will have at least one of these criteria. And there's a really, really good methodology, the reference for which is there if you're interested, which underpins the selection criteria. So Plantlife in the early 2000s led on the identification of IPAs around the world, and our global program continues to drive this approach forward. So all over the world, countries are adopting the IPA approach. And here's just a snapshot of some of the countries which have adopted or are in the process of adopting and identifying their IPAs. And it seems to be working. IPAs are leading to positive outcomes for plants in places like South Africa, Cameroon, Montana, all over the world. The system seems to be working. So we're here talking about Scotland. Why am I telling you this? I guess it's because I think it's important to frame everything that we're doing, even at the smallest site level, even at the level of a tiny site like Beaumains that Roy mentioned, in terms of its global impact. The actions that we take for plants are part of a huge movement to try to restore these very foundations of our threatened ecosystems. So Scotland has 47 IPAs, cover nearly 700,000 hectares, which is about 9% of our land area. It's important to remember that these IPAs don't carry any legal protection although some of them might happen to be triple SIs, they won't necessarily be, but they're a really, really powerful way of focusing attention and focusing resources on areas which we think need help. And they guide almost all of our work in Scotland. So this evening, I thought we'd look at 4 of our most diverse and exciting IPAs. So we're going to start by heading up to the very far north of the mainland of Scotland, to our wild and rugged north coast. So as the eagle flies, it's just under 100 miles from Cape Wrath in the west over to John O'Groats in the east, but the intricate and complex coastline of the north coast means that in actual fact the coastline is an awful lot longer. It's a wild place. The north coast is very exposed, it's battered by winds which come blasting down from the Arctic, and an incredible ecosystem clings onto the edge of this coastline. It's an ecosystem whose isolation and geography has given rise to a unique collection of species, some of which are found nowhere else in the world. Okay, so this is our Plantlife members of staff who work up on the north coast. So I guess when they're there, they're not found anywhere else in the world, but there's something else in this photo as well. There's a plant species in this photo that's maybe too small to see. It's a tiny species, and I think we're probably going to have to zoom in a little bit to see it. And there it is. That is the Scottish primrose. So that is a species which is found on Scotland's north coast and on Orkney and nowhere else in the world. And it's tiny. People are often really surprised when they come face to face with the plant, when they finally find it, how small it is. It's a really, really small primrose, and it's particularly surprising how small it is when you consider where it likes to live. And this is the preferred habitat of the Scottish primrose. The waves that come crashing onto the north coast, you know, they come all the way from the Arctic, and in the winter the storms are quite incredible. They can break right over the cliffs onto the grassland above, and it's that grassland, that strip of grassland along the tops of the cliffs, which is where the Scottish primrose lives. So obviously it must be a pretty tough species to be able to withstand that kind of battering. And it is, but in other ways it's really, really vulnerable. In recent years, we know that 75 populations of Scottish primrose have been lost, and it's becoming much, much harder to find along the north coast and on Orkney. And changes in land management seem to be at the heart of its decline. So a big thing that we're doing up on the north coast is working to train local volunteers to help us monitor populations. We are working with landowners to develop and then implement management plans which will create favourable conditions for this species, both on the north coast and over on Orkney. And we're really conscious that if we don't do that, if we lose this species from the project area, then we'll lose it from the entire world. That's the thing about these endemics, and there's a few endemics along the north coast, and we just can't allow that to happen. So as well as the Scottish primrose, there's an awful lot of other interesting species in the IPA along the north coast that's extraordinary for a whole range of reasons. One of those reasons is that it's a really, really good place to see a phenomenon called altitudinal descent. Now, this is where upland plants, mountaintop plants are found at sea level. And this is because the harsh, northerly, wild, cold conditions found along the north coast of Scotland mean that plants, which are usually only found on the tops of mountains, can thrive by the coast here. There are good populations, really, really good populations of mountain avens in some parts of the north coast. This is a photo of Mountain Everlasting. Quite happy here in its seaside location. It's quite extraordinary to see these species assemblages that you would normally associate with the tops of mountains so close to sea level. And here's another rare mountain plant that's hanging on the north coast. This is purple Oxytropis. So elsewhere in Europe, this is a strictly mountain plant. It's an alpine species, and it is found on a handful of Scottish mountains as well. It is clinging on to a couple of other coastal locations, but really its main coastal location is the north coast of Scotland. This is where its stronghold is. And similar to Scottish primrose, changes in land management seem to be affecting purple Oxytropis. It doesn't cope well with too much grazing, but it also doesn't really do very well on sites where scrub and tall vegetation become dominant. It can be outcompeted, so it's quite a fussy plant. So again, our team have been carrying out surveys of purple Oxytropis this summer. It seems to be surviving best on steep cliffs and on slopes where grazing animals can't get to it. On some of its sites, on some of the flatter dune sites, it also seems to be losing out to non-native conifer seedlings, which is seeding in from neighbouring plantations, which is a bit of a worry. Using the results from the initial surveys, which we've carried out this past season, will help us to develop advice for land managers, which we'll go on to implement in future years of the project. And as you can see from these photos, it really does like some very, very steep hair-raising cliffs. But along the north coast, it's not all cliffs, and it's worth exploring some of the flatter areas as well, some of the beaches. There's always something interesting to see, including this plant. So this is oyster plant. Now, oyster plant lives exclusively next to the sea. It's not a species that you would find in the mountains at all. It is exclusively coastal species, and it prefers these shingly, gravelly beaches. And although it used to be quite common, quite widespread, now it has been completely lost from England and Wales, as far as we know, completely extinct there. And its stronghold in the UK is now Scotland. It seems to be moving north in response to climate change. So it really is a plant of the seaside. It's called oyster plant. Apparently its leaves taste of oysters. I don't know. I've never tried them, but that's what I'm told. And it relies on the sea, really, for its life cycle to be completed. Once its seeds have been produced, then those seeds are picked up in the water and the tidal currents disperse the seeds. Immersion in those cold northern waters doesn't seem to do the seeds any harm, and then the seeds are washed sometimes a long, long way onto new beaches where they germinate and grow up into new flowers. The Gaelic name for oyster plant translates as gift from the sea, which is really nice and a nice reference to this really interesting life cycle. So we're trying to understand the current range of oyster plant on the north coast and on Orkney and Shetland as well. It's very, very vulnerable to grazing, and in the past it's been really hit by commercial shingle extraction. Now, these northern populations are becoming hugely important as the plant retreats, and we really need to better understand the impacts of climate change for species like this. So we've got a hope of saving it. I suppose all our work on the north coast is all carried out through a project currently called Species on the Edge. The species that we're working on through this project are quite literally on the edge. They're clinging on to this narrow strip of exposed coast, and they're also clinging on to survival. They're facing a really, really uncertain future, but hopefully through the project, through the Species on the Edge project, we're going to give them a bit of a chance. So that's the north coast. It's a bit of a flavour of some of the activity which is happening on the north coast. If we jump just slightly inland, we find ourselves in the Caithness and Sutherland's important plant area. Now, this is a very different habitat. This is a vast expanse of blanket bog covering nearly 200,000 hectares, which makes it the largest expanse of blanket bog in Europe. And it's quite an incredible place. Not the easiest place to get to know, not the easiest place to get around, certainly, but once you do get in and start looking at the detail, it's a stunning place. Around 2,000 hectares of that much bigger 200,000 hectares is a Plantlife nature reserve. Now, Plantlife doesn't own a lot of land. We don't have a huge amount of nature reserves. Scottish Wildlife Trust obviously does. We don't. And Montsbury peatlands is our only nature reserve in Scotland. So our main way of working is through establishing partnerships, relationships with land managers and communities, and working with them to carry out research and practical conservation. But here at Montsbury, we do look after a nature reserve in the heart of the flow country, and we're working really hard to try and restore the blanket bog in the flow country. It's an incredibly special place. Blanket bog is actually, although it might look quite uniform, it's incredibly diverse, and there's a whole range of different vegetation types which we've managed to record on the site, and of course a whole range of species as well. You know, there's nearly 150 vascular plant species, 200 species of bryophyte. We've got 38 species of spider, 27 species of moth. We've got breeding birds like greenshank, dunlin, golden plover, hen harrier, merlin. It's an absolutely incredible place. But like most of Scotland's peatlands, it has been extensively modified, and a huge number of drains were put into it in the past. Now, these drains were put in to try to dry the land out to make it more suitable for grazing livestock. Now, obviously, this drainage is lethal for blanket bogs, that plant diversity there. And what we've been doing is working to try to restore the peatland to its natural condition. And that's involved putting in over 1,000 dams to block the drains and to raise the water table. And we're just about to start on another phase of peatland restoration. And all the restoration work is coupled with extensive monitoring to ensure that the vegetation is responding in the way that we hope it's going to. Now, one of the most significant and worrying threats which we're facing on the nature reserve at the moment is invasive non-native conifers, again, seeding in from neighbouring plantations. So these invasive trees, they get onto the bog, they dry the bog out, and they result in the loss of the specialist plant communities. They also allow for a safe route for ground predators to come out of the forests onto the nature reserve to prey on the nests of some of those really, really rare birds. And the ground predators that we see most often doing this on Montsbury are pine martens. So a big part of the next phase of the project is for us to try to get on top of this non-native regeneration and try and control these species. It's a huge ongoing job, and that picture is reflected across the flow country. So Montsbury, it's a big site, it's a complex site, but the idea with it is that if we can demonstrate good management and good restoration of the habitat on our own nature reserve, then we can use this to advocate for peatland restoration more widely across the Caithness and Sutherland important plant area, and hopefully as well across the whole of the country. So that is the north of Scotland. What we're going to do now is we're going to jump south, and we are most definitely going to go uphill into the Cairngorms, to one of our largest IPAs, I think one of my favourite IPAs, the UK's largest area of high ground. The ecology of the Cairngorms is very, very complex, and this complexity is reflected in the notification of the important plant area. It's notified for a huge and perplexing collection of specialist habitats, including some very, very niche habitats. But broadly, the IPA ranges from these stunning high mountain plateaus into the ancient Caledonian pine forests, which must be one of Scotland's most iconic habitats. They're really, really inspiring places. Now, our ancient pine woods are a shadow of their former selves, but in the fragments that remain, then we find some of our most well-loved and specialist species, and they're famous for them. They're famous for capercaillie, they're famous for crested-tipped osprey, wildcat. and some specialist pinewood plants which are found nowhere else. So this is one-flowered wintergreen, or Monoesis uniflora, one-flowered wintergreen. It lives in pine woods. It's one of our rarest species, and it's undergone significant declines. In fact, our project manager, who works in the Cairngorms, reckons that if we don't do anything about it, if we don't take action, then we might soon see all the one-flower wintergreen in the UK disappear. So through our current project and through the research and the surveys that we've been doing in the Cairngorms, we've discovered that even within the national park, it's been lost from most of its former sites. So what we've been doing is working with land managers and species experts to try to come up with a plan for it, to understand the conditions that it needs to thrive. And just at the end of last year, in the autumn of last year, we undertook the first ever translocation of one-flowered wintergreen, which was into the RSPB's nature reserve at Abernethy Forest, in an effort to try and strengthen the population there. It's early days and it's quite an experimental translocation. I think it's going to be a difficult species to work on, but we really have to do something because of the declines that we are seeing. And the structure of the flower is really, really beautiful. So it's worth kind of zooming in and having a bit of a closer look. One of the reasons for its historical decline were because it was such a popular plant with plant collectors. Luckily, that doesn't happen anymore, but you can see it is a gorgeous species. It's got some lovely other names as well. Old names, old common names. Olaf's candlestick was one of its names. Single delight. Frog's reading lamp, which is a really nice one, I think. And you know, these species, they're just as important as the capercaillie, just as important and iconic as the crested tit, but no one's really been taking any action for one-flowered wintergreen. Hopefully, we'll give it a future. Okay, so now here's another pinewood specialist, which really does have its headquarters in the Cairngorms. This is twinflower. Plantlife have been working on twinflower for a while, as have a range of other organisations and individuals. And I suppose in a way, twinflower kind of encapsulates all the issues facing most of the species that we've looked at so far. It's a really, really specialist species. It relies on a very, very rare habitat, which has been severely depleted. And the remaining populations of twinflower are too far apart from each other to allow pollination to happen. So this means that without any intervention, the remaining plants will simply die out. So through our project in the Cairngorms, we've been working with land managers, we've been working with communities, and we've been working with schools to try to reconnect twinflower populations to give them a chance of survival. So we have, with the help of communities, we've carefully taken twinflower plants from healthy populations. We've grown them on to ensure that the plants are bulked up, they're strong, they're ready to go back out into the wild. And then we've worked with landowners to find suitable reintroduction sites where these new plants are now being planted out. What we're doing is we're carefully bringing together plants with different genetic makeups, allowing cross-fertilization to make populations healthier and more resilient. So as well as their new plants, the land managers or landowners, they also receive training, they receive a management plan, and ongoing advice and support from Plantlife staff and volunteers. And doing this work in a partnership with some of the younger residents in the Cairngorms has been a really, really important part of the project for Plantlife. So here's some of the junior rangers in the Cairngorms who've helped with every stage of this process and who hopefully now feel connected to the survival of this rare plant. With a bit of luck, they'll go on to be the advocates and the ambassadors for this rare species in the future. The plants which we put in 2023, they are already growing on well, and you can see them here spreading. Twinflower has a creeping kind of behavior. It spreads across the forest floor. So they seem to be surviving, thriving in their new homes. And we're a bit closer to our aim of restoring twinflower across the pine woods of the Cairngorms. So when you're in the Cairngorms forest, whenever you look up, you're reminded that you're in the mountains. And that's really, really important. These habitat transitions are really, really important, from wetland into forest, and from forest into high mountain. And the scale of the Cairngorms IPA is such that there's a real opportunity to restore these transitions, putting together all those pieces of the ecosystem jigsaw puzzle. And in some places, it's really urgent that we do that. And some pieces of the puzzle have been missing for a very, very long time. Now, whilst the pine woods in the northern Cairngorms are once again expanding, which is really, really good news, the situation is very different in other parts of the IPA. In some parts of the IPA, wild plant populations are clinging to survival, quite often clinging to survival on the faces of steep cliffs. Now, these cliffs aren't their natural home, and many of these plant communities can be found in mainland Europe, spreading out across hillsides luxuriantly and living in woodlands right across landscapes like this. But here in Scotland, they've been driven into these inaccessible refuges. Now, the interaction between wild deer populations and wild plant populations is very, very complex, but it's a simple fact that a vast area of the Cairngorms important plant area is suffering from overgrazing caused by high deer numbers. Some land managers have worked hard to reduce deer numbers, and we're seeing the positive effects of this in places like Glenfeshie. But in other places, deer numbers are extremely high. So I took this photo in an area where the average deer density is around 26 deer per square kilometre. Now, the Cairngorms National Park Authority recommend a deer density of between 5 and 8 deer per square kilometre to avoid impacts to the natural heritage. So you can see there's a long way to go. So what are some of those impacts? Well, essentially, the impacts are pretty drastic. We're missing an entire habitat, mountain woodlands, transitioning from forest through scrub to dwarf shrubs, has been essentially lost from almost all of Scotland. And that's mountain willows, juniper, those stunted, twisted pines should be forming a rich mosaic, really, at these high altitudes, kind of messed through with a whole range of other vascular plants, lichens, and bryophytes. And we just don't have that habitat at all. The remaining last few vestiges of this habitat cling to the few ledges and cliffs that are out of the reach of deer. And even getting a glimpse of these plant communities is challenging and dangerous. So it's no wonder really that collectively we've kind of forgotten that these habitats should exist. Species like globeflower, extremely sensitive to grazing. Most of our mountain populations of globeflower, along with species like alpine blue sow thistle, they're forced to kind of eke out living in suboptimal conditions on cliff faces. Their populations fragmented and isolated from each other. It's not all bad news. Away from the cliffs, you can find relatively stable populations of beautiful species like this Scottish asphodel, this dwarf cornel, and moonworts, which is hanging on in the mountains after having been lost from a whole range of its lowland grassland sites. It's a beautiful, tiny little fern. But the fact is that the Cairngorms isn't as diverse as it should be for wild plants. It's not just the deer. As well as the deer, other impacts are ramping up as well. Climate change is reducing the snow cover in the mountains. Many of our mountain plants are adapted to cold conditions and need snow cover to survive. Fewer snowy winters mean fewer mountain specialist plants because they are outcompeted by more generalist species which move up the hill, push the more delicate species out, taking advantage of the benign conditions which we're starting to see now. And right up on the high plateaus, we find ourselves in a unique Arctic-like environment. So it's characterized in many places by this moss, which is Racemitrium or woolly fringe moss. Racemitrium heath is a really, really important species, both in its own right as a habitat for rare birds like dotterel, but this fragile moss and the whole habitat which it's found in is facing a very uncertain future. Now, one of the strange things about mountain ecosystems is that the threats which jeopardize them, jeopardize their future, can often originate hundreds or even thousands of miles away. Nitrogen pollution is one of the biggest threats facing our wild plants. Nitrogen from industry, which is often in the form of nitrous oxide, gets into the atmosphere. When it's in the atmosphere, it gets carried vast distances. So when nitrogen-heavy clouds hit high mountain ranges, this pollution-laden rain pours down. So this means that mountain areas are often disproportionately affected by nitrogen pollution. Mountaintops contain specialist rare ecosystems because in many cases they're low in nutrients. Now, nitrogen is essentially a fertilizer. So when this nitrogen-laced rain pours down on the mountains, what we're essentially doing is dumping vast quantities of fertilizer onto this fragile habitat. Now, that encourages common thuggish plants to grow higher up the hill, and we're seeing vast areas where rare mossy habitats are being replaced by common lowland grasses. The Racemitrium heath begins to break up with devastating knock-on effects for birds like the dotterel. And of course, all that grass encourages even more deer into these fragile ecosystems. And that grass supports even higher numbers of deer. So it becomes a vicious circle. The link between nitrogen pollution and deer numbers isn't talked about much, but it's a massive driver of deer population growth. So what Plantlife are doing at the moment on all of this is to try and work with researchers to understand how our uplands are changing, how fast they're changing, and advocating for changes in national and international law to tackle air pollution. You know, the Cairngorm's important plant area is big enough to have a real future, even if the impacts of climate change can't be tackled. What we need to do, though, is we need to think big, and we need to think about restoring whole functioning ecosystems to be in with a chance of retaining our rare mountain plants. Okay, so we've got one final IPA to visit, and what we're going to do now is jump over to Scotland's largest IPA. We're heading for Scotland's rainforest. So globally, temperate rainforest is an incredibly rare habitat. It thrives in areas which are not too hot, not too cold, but which experience significant steady rainfall, which is, when you think about it, a perfect description of the west coast of Scotland. As soon as you walk into a rainforest, you're hit by how luxuriant it all is. There's hardly any bare surfaces anywhere. Everywhere has been colonized by lichens, by mosses and ferns. The superstar species of the rainforest really are the lichens and the bryophytes. It's these species which make Scotland's rainforest internationally important. So our rainforest, Scotland's rainforest, has the greatest concentration of oceanic bryophytes and lichens in the whole of Europe, and they're growing in huge profusion. Some of them are really, really odd-looking things like this octopus suckers. This is an earwort, pouncewort, and this is hazel gloves fungus, which is a specialist fungus which, as the name suggests, lives exclusively on old growth hazel trees. As you might look at this and think that the hazel gloves fungus is feeding on the hazel itself, but it actually isn't. It's feeding on another fungus, something called the glue crust fungus, which feeds on the hazel. And then the hazel gloves fungus, which is the thing which is visible to us, comes along and then feeds on it. It's quite an incredible ecological relationship. The rainforest is packed full of other wildlife: pied, flycatcher, checkered skipper, just to name a couple. The rainforest zone is the climatic zone where rainforest should and certainly could exist, and it's vast. It's that area in blue on the left-hand side of the map there. But the remaining fragments of rainforest are scattered across the rainforest zone. So what we need to do to be with the chance of saving the rainforest is to restore these fragments and then to join them back up again for the rainforest to thrive. And the rainforest is facing threats. Invasive non-native species are one of the top 5 drivers of biodiversity loss across the world. And here in Scotland, that picture is very much reflected in the rainforest. So invasive species are one of the most significant threats that we're facing. Rhododendron ponticum, which I'm sure is familiar to lots of people, is this purple flowered plant you can see in the photo here, is thriving in the rainforest. It's escaped from gardens, it's choking out the life from the rainforests, it colonizes and it dominates rainforest woodlands. It suppresses tree regeneration and it shades out those rare lichens and bryophytes. We estimate that rhododendron needs to be cleared from a massive 12,000 hectares of core rainforest, which is a huge proportion of rainforest that needs urgent attention. So it's not just rhododendron. Around a fifth of Scotland's rainforests have been planted up with commercial non-native timber crops. So if you look really, really carefully, you might be able to see the fragment of rainforest hanging on in the gully in the middle of this photo, surrounded to the left and the right by non-native conifer plantations. And of course, another threat is deer. They're a significant issue. More than 40% of the rainforest is grazed and browsed so heavily that natural regeneration is unlikely to occur. Some grazing within the rainforest is good and important. Deer are a natural woodland animal and an important part of the rainforest ecosystem, but we're seeing them at unnaturally high levels at the moment, which mean that the rainforest is essentially dying on its feet. There's no saplings, no tree regeneration coming through, and it's a huge problem for the future of the rainforest. The good news is that we know what to do about it. We know how to save the rainforest, and we've started to make progress. Plantlife, along with Scottish Wildlife Trust, are partners in the Alliance for Scotland's Rainforest, which is a partnership of well over 20 organisations now, which have come together to try to strategically tackle these threats and to save Scotland's rainforest. Ultimately, we want to get from this to this. And in the rainforest, just like in all our important plant areas, we can only do that by working in partnership with other organisations, with communities, with enthusiasts, with land managers, and with decision makers. So that's a very quick look at just 4 of Scotland's 47 important plant areas, and they're just a fraction of the hundreds and probably thousands now of important plant areas around the world. We're all trying to do the same thing, to work together to save our wild plants and fungi, which are essentially our life support system. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Alistair. That was absolutely fantastic, with some fantastic pictures in there and fantastic landscapes. Now, I've just had a wee reminder from somebody about something I missed at the start. So before we go into questions, I'll give Alistair a quick minute to catch his breath before we get into your questions. We've got some great questions to ask. But the thing I forgot was when our next talk, and also our sister group over in Calendar, the Calendar SWT group, when their next talk is. So Calendar SWT, their talk is an in-person one in one of the church halls in Calendar. Check their webpage for the details. It's at 7:30, 15th of March, and that's on bird flu. And that's by, I believe, the head of the Seabird Centre at North Berwick. So that's just coming up. So please have a look there for that. our next one is on the 5th of March, and that's going to be by Anthony McCluskey of Butterfly Conservation. And actually, I believe one of the species you're going to cover, Alistair showed us there, the checkered skipper. Alistair's going to talk to us about some of our rarest butterflies of Scotland. And then he's going to focus in as well on some of our local rarities and what's going on locally for them, and also how you can get involved. So please do look at, I think the booking links are live for those now up on the SWT webpage. So please do book onto them and tell others who might be interested as well. So thank you very much again, Alistair. That was fantastic talk. What a journey. We went from the coast up into the mountains, and then back into the rainforest. How many people, and don't forget the bogs, of course, one of my personal favourites. But how many people thought we were going to be talking about rainforest as well? So just, I may have got the date wrong there for the calendar one, folks. Somebody just said it's 15th of February. I hope that's what I said. If not, 15th of February for the calendar one. So yeah, what a fantastic journey through Scotland. I think another thing you really showed us there is how degraded and unfortunately some of our habitats is. What fantastic stuff we have, what fantastic habitats we have, but also what we're missing when we look at the mountains. We think, wow, rugged wild mountains, but as you say, we're almost missing this whole habitat type in there, which is quite scary. But also, I was amazed at some of the stuff in the rainforest there. And I think overall, you taught me a whole load of things I'm going to have to go away and look up plant-wise, things I'd never heard of. One-flowered wintergreen, the oyster plant as well, the octopus cups on that was amazing. The hazel fungus gloves, that looks a lot like what I know to be dead man's fingers in the ocean, the soft coral. It looks so much similar. So some absolutely fantastic stuff there. And thank you so much for showing us all that. Just so many things I had no idea existed. I'm sure the same for everybody else. So we've got some questions. We've got a whole kind of mix of questions. I'm just trying to think of the best one to start with. So I think one of kind of quite a technical question, I guess, and it's where when you come across a plant, like I guess the one-flowered wintergreen is maybe a good example, and you identify, all right, this plant's in problems. This is it. It needs something for conservation access. Conservation work. Something has to be done. How do you? That just seems such an enormous challenge. How do you take it from, oh dear, it's in trouble, to actually making something happen and delivering for that species? What's the sort of general process you have to go through?
So good question, and it is a difficult process, and every species tends to have a different starting point, but there are some kind of commonalities. I don't know if people have heard, you maybe haven't, of a concept called the species recovery curve. So what the species recovery curve is essentially, it looks like a line graph, and it is a curve, and it describes a kind of trajectory like that. And over at this end, over on my left-hand side, is the very, very initial fact-finding stages that you might have to go through to establish the current status and condition and health of a species. And then what the curve does is it takes you through all the steps that you need to get to end up at this point up here, which is where we're trying to get to, which is a long-term, sustainable, viable future for the species that doesn't need a huge amount, if any, intervention. And each of these stages is quite well described. So the first stage is very much a research stage. It really is finding out everything that we need to know about the species, its ecology, its habitat, how it reproduces, its genetics, how genetically related different parts of the population are, to really give us as good an understanding as possible of where it is. Then the next stage is a trial and testing stage, which I suppose is the stage that we're in for one-flowered wintergreen. We've got a theory that translocation might work, but it's never been done before, and we're at this testing stage working with the RSPB at Abernethy there to trial it. It's a complicated species that has very, very specific mycorrhizal associations. The fungi in the soil are a really big part of its success ecologically, I think. If that goes well, that trial then will be at the stage of rolling out a wider translocation to try and replicate that, hopefully getting to a point where the species has some sort of a sustainable future. But it's a great question, and I haven't probably done justice to it there, but there are stages that we go through to try and get to a point where the species is viable.
Well, that's fantastic, Alistair. It's fascinating we can get onto that. The way we can chart it, that there's a way to chart it. There's a way to put it into a system, and I can totally say that it's that sort of fact finding, I guess, at first, and what state is it in? I suppose if you're really lucky, you might find that actually a species just under recorded. I suppose there's always that chance that that might be the case, and it can stop there. If not, it's like, well, what could we do? Let's trial it. Let's put it into action, and let's then roll it out wider and wider. I think it gives some hope that we know we can do these things and we can structure them. So no, thank you for that. It's amazing to know that's a system there that can help. One question we got, in fact, there's a couple of deer related questions. The first one is, do you think the Scottish government's the changes that have come up, or their proposed changes to deer management, how hopeful are you that's going to make a difference, or is it still going to be a concern?
It's a huge step forward. So Plantlife, along with Scottish Wildlife Trust and a whole range of other NGOs, have been calling for changes to the way deer are managed in Scotland for a long time now, and been really trying to highlight some of the things that I was touching on there in the talk about the impact that deer are having on ecosystems. I think there's a better chance now than we've seen for a long time of seeing significant change. And I think that change is coming from government, but it's also coming from the deer management sector. There's a common understanding that because of what we're facing in terms of biodiversity and climate, because deer have huge impact on tree planting targets that are associated with our climate change targets, there's a real recognition from across the board that things do need to change, and that the trajectories that we're seeing and the numbers and the densities that we're seeing and those impacts aren't sustainable. So the current consultation is a result of the recommendations put forward by the Independent Deer Working Group from a few years ago, which have now been adopted in proposed form by the Scottish Government. And I was just looking at them this afternoon. There's some quite transformational stuff in there. So yes, I would say it's part of the picture, and I'm cautiously optimistic. It's a hugely complex thing, and you get into really, really important discussions around rural economics, rural livelihoods, and it's important to understand different perspectives and people's concerns. But I think there is a way forward now, and it's because of that shared understanding and people coming together. So I'm feeling cautiously optimistic on deer.
Oh, that's I think really good. No, I think we underestimate. We often underestimate the damage they're having, but I think it's quite clear from those, the slides you were showing in the upland areas, particularly where you could look and see all those upland plant species, and some of them are amazing. Almost like the things you should be getting in your garden. Would you think we have them in the wild in Scotland? But they are just hanging on just outside of deer reach, and we certainly have had this a species locally, sticky catch fly, that the group's doing some work for. And we're fortunate that some of the sheep and some of the roe deer grazing has been controlled recently. But until then, it used to be you could tell the line on the crags where the sheep could reach in their hind legs, and even to the point some of the plants were nibbled through in the middle. And it just the impact that was having, the change. It's almost very difficult to see until you see like the pictures like you showed there, and you realise, oh wait, that's what we should have all over, not just in that rock face over there. And that's one of the other questions is about roe deer. I mean, do roe deer, are they as big a concern? Are they having as big an impact as the red deer?
Yeah, they are. It depends on the habitat that you're looking at. So in the upland areas, it's red deer, but some of the lowland woodlands, particularly in the central belt that I can think of that I used to look after, used to manage, significantly impacted by roe deer. And roe deer numbers have been increasing along with red deer numbers. So it's because of the more, so roe deer are more lowland species. They tend to be found in habitat mosaics, woodland, farmland, and they move between them. They have huge impacts on those remaining fragments of woodland. Controlling them and managing them is even more difficult than the upland populations, and that is because of the fragmented nature of land ownership, which means that collaborative efforts to control deer in the areas where roe deer are quite frequently found can be much, much more challenging. When you've got one big landowner or maybe 3 or 4 big landowners, then it can be quite easy to bring them together to come up with some sort of a collaborative plan. When you've got lots and lots of landowners in a lowland area, that can be more challenging. But yes, if we're going to tackle deer, then we have to tackle deer across the board. And that's not to say we need to get rid of them. We just need to bring them to sustainable levels so they can live as they should do within woodlands at levels which aren't going to impact the species and the habitats.
Yeah. I got shocked this morning. I looked at, I live near to in Fife at the moment, and I just looked out the window this morning onto the farmland, and there was 6 of them standing in the middle of the farmland. You think, wow. And I know there's another group just up the road. How many? And somebody recently that I know works in forestry showed me some thermal imaging drone surveys, and they said, how many roe deer do you think are there? I said, oh, well, 5, 10, and there was 90, and you think, oh, wow, okay. So I guess they're going a wee bit more hidden than the bigger red deer, but still having that huge impact in there as well. We've had a couple of questions, I suppose, are kind of similar bits, and it's how do we, for some of these actions and conservation that we're needing, is there ways that industry and commercially they can help fund that? So, getting that commercial buy-in to help fund it? Is there anything being used for that or being looked at that? And also connected to that, somebody says there's not anything that's being done or can be done to make the industry that's doing a lot of the forestry planting help with the Sitka spruce control and other exotic conifers. I think somebody almost suggested a bit like, the kind of polluter pays principle. If they are putting them out, can they not be responsible for helping them? So kind of 2 almost connected questions. How does industry and business and things, how can they help do that? And is that being tapped into, or is that an underutilized resource?
So on the polluter pays and the impacts of commercial forestry, yes, we are pushing for some kind of a recognition of the impact, and for a polluter pays principle, that's a very difficult thing to get through at the moment, and we're up against big interests in commercial forestry, which are pushing back very hard. So that's a fight that we're having at the moment. But the evidence that we've got from our own site and that partner organisations have from other blanket bog sites, but also the evidence more widely from the way that Sitka spruce and lodgepole pine are impacting on rainforest sites, on upland sites, really even up to the tops of the mountains and some of those fragile habitats that we're seeing. The evidence is becoming stronger and stronger, and we've got a better chance now with the evidence that we've got of pushing back more strongly on this. And I think a polluter pays principle is the way to go, because otherwise it is down to charities, organisations like ourselves to ask our members and supporters to contribute to the impacts which are being caused by a commercial operation. So yes, I think there's more that we can and should be doing on that, but we've got the evidence to do it. So that's one that we're pushing on, our advocacy people are pushing on at the moment. On the joining up of commercial interests and maybe private investment with some of the habitat and species restoration that we're doing, that's a really live topic at the moment, and one that we're absolutely going to have to collectively address as a sector. So the rainforest is a good example. We costed out how much we thought rainforest restoration on the west coast of Scotland would cost. So we thought, okay, well, we want to save the rainforest. Well, the only way we can really do that credibly is by coming up with a figure. How much is it going to cost? How much is it going to cost to control the rhododendron, to get on top of the deer, to restore these fragments and bring them back together? So there's some quite detailed calculations behind this, but we came up with a figure of £500 million. This is a big sum. We know that the public sector isn't going to be able to pay £500 million to save Scotland's rainforest. That's not a credible ask to take to Scottish Government. So we know that we're going to have to unlock significant levels of private finance to support this. We do need the government. We need the government to invest, and we need the government to pave the way in terms of making some of the links between ourselves and big investors. But there are huge gains for commercial investment in certainly carbon. The ethics of that are questionable, but I think if we want to tap into private resource, then we have to, just as in the same way that the peatland code is done for peat, we need to look at that for the rainforest. And obviously we've got the woodland codes for woodland creation more generally, but specifically for rainforest, there's more that we can do to make the links between rainforest restoration and carbon, and also biodiversity credits. Biodiversity offsetting is something which I know a huge number of people are looking at. And again, there's ethical questions around about that. But if we are serious about bringing in the private investment that we need, then we need to get better at packaging up what we're doing and speaking a language which we're not particularly comfortable speaking. It's a language of financial investment, and it's a language which we're starting to learn how to speak with brokers and people who are acting as go-betweens between ourselves, who are very comfortable out doing the habitat restoration on the ground, and those big impenetrable financial worlds. There's a lot of money out there available, and there's a lot of good restoration that needs to be done. But bringing those two things together is the challenge that we've got at the moment. But we're working with Nature Scott, for example, on that, and various projects are happening at the moment to try and make those links, because that's the only way we're going to do this at the scale that we need to do it.
Yeah, I think some of your figures just made it clear how much we need. Was that 500 million for the rhododendron, just in the rainforest area?
So that's the restoration, so including the rhododendron, but then other things as well. So there's that figure is made up of all the deer, the rhododendron, a whole range of different things that we need to do to restore the rainforest. But that's a robust figure, and it is a big and scary figure.
Yeah, it does, just as you say, it just shows how much we do need to tap into those kind of other funding schemes. Interesting, as you say, it's about almost getting the language right. I guess as conservationists, the ecologists, we're kind of putting. I guess we're almost maybe uncomfortable sometimes putting some of the financial language and wording to it, but it's kind of an essential, and it's not necessarily a bad thing, and it's sort of, I guess, getting that communication right between the two sides. It's just such a big. It's something I've not. You don't really think about it, but it's almost like two different languages, isn't it, to kind of get right.
It needs to be done right, and it needs to be done properly. So we always conscious of the risk of greenwashing, and we need to make sure that if we are doing this, then we're in control, and we're doing it, and we're measuring it. We're measuring the impact of it and demonstrating the impact of it, and we've got control of the narrative, because we could easily lose control of that narrative. And that's one of the big risks of going chasing these sorts of sums. So yeah, doing it properly is crucial to its success.
Yeah, I suppose the greenwashing, I mean, somebody might be paying for either carbon they need captured, or impacts on biodiversity they've had with some other part of their business or development or whatever. It's just making sure, well, what they're actually paying for is they are delivering at least what they had impacted on. But I think we probably want even better, to give us an extra, an enhancement on top of that, I guess, is the message, really.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we really need to
push it almost to the next level. There's another question I've just seen, it's deer related, that just popped in about venison, and saying, is there anything being done in terms of campaigns to promote Scottish venison that might help with the deer problem?
Yeah, it's a good question because obviously we've got this massive resource and the market is growing, but it's still a small market. So yes, there is. That's part of the current consultation, the current Scottish Government consultation on deer. In the rainforest, we are developing a project at the moment which covers a whole range of things, particularly around skills development, to help us be sure that communities on the West Coast have got the skills to do all this work, all this rhododendron control, for example, all the kind of practical woodland management that's going to be needed to restore the rainforest. But a big part of that is looking at the infrastructure and the support to build more sustainable venison markets. So there's a whole program around community deer larders that we're looking at. There's a whole program around training a new generation of stalkers. And what we're really trying to do is build links between communities and deer control. So this isn't just Plantlife doing this. This is the Alliance for Scotland's Rainforest doing this collaboratively on the West Coast, but looking at trying to build those links to facilitate a much better and stronger and more sustainable market for venison, because that is a huge part of it. It does seem strange that we haven't been able to do that as a nation, but the rainforest is certainly an area where we're at the very early stages of trialing that, and I think the success is going to be around much more community involvement in deer management than we've maybe seen to date.
I guess it's kind of another dimension that you bring in there as well. Is, we think, conserving these areas, and obviously we're conserving the species and we're looking after, and we know also looking after these habitats and the ecosystem services we get from them and how important they are. But there's almost like another dimension that's come in there as well, that actually restoring these, it can bring about local jobs. It can bring around local business. It's part of our economy. It's not separate. It's very much restoring can be part of, I guess, green recovery is the word as well, or words.
That's a big part of it, definitely. We need these skills. We need these skills in these rural areas where we're working, and we are very conscious that in some of these areas there simply aren't those skills at the moment because nobody's had the confidence to invest in building those skills. So if we're going to somehow secure big sums of money to save the rainforest, then we're going to need to make sure that the skills are in place and that people have got the confidence to invest, to start businesses and deliver this stuff with us on the ground. So the links between what we're trying to do and rural livelihoods, rural economies are really, really strong. And again, particularly through the work on the rainforest, but also through our other work on grassland habitats and where we're working with agriculture, we're learning much better, I think, to make those links and to work with communities to build livelihoods and ecological features as well.
Yeah, I think it's just so important and it's so intertwined. We maybe don't sometimes view that whole picture, that community economy, and how it is actually all coming together. Got just a couple of last questions. One that I just had actually forgot about, it's probably quite important to ask, is there any chance of more important plant areas in Scotland? Is this a process that's finished, or is there likely to be more?
So that is an interesting question. At the moment, the important plant areas for vascular plants, certainly, I don't think we're going to review again. And I think we're confident that we've got the data to support the current suite being probably the most appropriate suite, but that could change in the future. But we are aware that there are significant levels of lichen and bryophyte data which have become available more recently since the last iteration of the IPAs, which we do need to use to look at the IPA boundaries again. Now, bringing in that new data might change the boundaries. It might expand the boundaries of some important plant areas, and it could very well lead to the identification of new important plant areas for lichens and bryophytes. So our data team are currently going through the process of crunching all this data, applying the IPA criteria, and looking at what that might look like for the suite of IPAs across the UK, actually. So that is very live at the moment. So I think, yes, for lichens and bryophytes, we could see some changes, and it's quite exciting seeing this new data coming through.
We forget almost about lichens and bryophytes. Actually, just before we let everybody in tonight, Alistair mentioned one of his colleagues can do a talk on lichens and bryophytes, and I think from some of the amazing pictures you've shown us of some tonight as well, I think that's definitely what we need to schedule for next year's section of talks. So we'll definitely follow up with that. I was going to say a slightly easier, the final question as such, but maybe it's difficult because of the amount of choice maybe it has. But there was a question about where can what's good places to go locally in this area to see plants, but also where's their nearest area? I think there was maybe a one in Crieff important plant area, and is that easy accessible to get into, and what can people expect to see there?
So for where to go locally, I mean, I would say that the Scottish Wildlife Trust reserves are so good. Going to Beaumains Meadow in the summer is just stunning. It's just such a good place. Canvas pools, which I definitely have to get back to now. I'm really keen to see the diathys, the maiden pink that you've put in, Roy, and see how that's getting on. There's the local SWT sites up into the Ochils. There's some really, really good sites there, some good triple SIs, and I guess the areas you are thinking about for the sticky cats fly, there's some really good local sites actually. But in terms of kind of local stuff, I guess Roy's your man to point you in the direction of some of the really, really good hotspots in and around Stirling. In terms of the IPAs, the nearest important plant area to Stirling is Flanders moss, which I guess many of you will be familiar with. So that's a NNR Nature Scot site, probably well known to lots of you, and it is the IPA boundary pretty much follows the triple SI boundary there from memory. And then, I think the next closest one will be the Crieff Woodlands, which, although they're called the Crieff Woodlands, it's a selection of two sites, one near Crieff and one near Comrie. The Comrie one is probably the most accessible, and it's a beautiful oak woodland with a really, really good range of lichens and bryophytes, some really interesting vascular plants as well. I think you can look at the details of that on our website, but essentially you can park at the golf club at Comrie and then walk up Glen Leadnock from the car park, and it takes you instantly into one of the largest areas of native oakwood in the area. And although it is in some areas being kind of encroached by other species, things like beech coming in, there's some really, really good examples of some really, really nice oak woodland and associated plant species there. Definitely worth a visit in the summer, so I would really recommend that one as a good place to go and explore.
That actually sounds absolutely beautiful. So that's definitely one to go to. Can't believe I missed Flanders Moss on your map. I didn't notice that. For anybody locally it's not been to recommend a visit, you've got a big viewing platform and boardwalk, so you can get right out onto a lowland raised bog without getting your feet wet. And you can also get that view from the tower. Absolutely amazing. It's a kind of bog for as far as I can see, and you really get a sense of the habitat. So fully recommend it. It's amazing. And if you do want to get involved in more plant stuff, I'd see some of the real local rarities. Roy's always looking for help with surveys. So are the local group. So please do contact us. I mean, you can help us survey, conserve some of these, and get to see them as well. And that very, very final point is how can people get involved and do more? How can they support Plantlife? How can they support other things? How can they support plant conservation in general?
So the big part of it is doing stuff locally, and we're really keen to support people to take local action for plants. the best thing I would say as a starting point is stay in touch with us. So you can subscribe to the Plantlife newsletter, which gives you an option of receiving information just about Scotland and what's happening in Scotland. So that's the best place to stay in touch with what we're doing through the projects, and how you can take part in things like No Mow May, for example, which is our kind of campaign to allow everybody who's got a garden or a wee bit of green space, something that they can do to really, really positively impact for wild plants, and that's coming up quite soon. There's a whole range of things like that. We're always looking for volunteers to adopt squares as part of our national plant monitoring scheme, which we carry out in conjunction with the Joint Nature Conservancy Council and Botanical Society of Britain and Ireland. If you Google NPMS, National Plant Monitoring Scheme, you'll be able to see through that a whole series of squares on a map that we're looking for people to adopt and visit once or twice a year and record the plants that you see there. You don't have to be an expert. There are different levels that you can participate at the beginner level, an intermediate level, and an expert level. That really helps us build up an understanding of how plant communities and plant populations are changing over time, because it's a long-term survey. It's very, very scientifically robust. The results are amazing and very, very useful for us to direct our conservation work and also our advocacy work. So if you're interested in becoming an NPMS volunteer, we'd be delighted to support you through that process. And there's various training courses and support that you can take advantage of. So if you're interested in that, then certainly look at the website or get in touch with me. And yeah, check out Plantlife's website for other ways of getting involved. We've always got new projects coming up. Interested in doing something in the Stirling area if we've got the resources. We don't have anybody in the Stirling area at the moment. As you've seen, our staff are kind of scattered all over the place, but always interested in new project ideas or working with local groups and local communities. So if there is something, if there's a particular species or particular habitat that you're interested in that we can maybe build a project around, then definitely let's talk about that, because yeah, we're really keen to expand what we're doing across Scotland.
Thank you very much, Alistair. And please, people, do check out Plantlife's website, the plant monitoring scheme. Is that I get
Yeah,
that?
yeah, National Plant Monitoring Scheme. Yeah,
National Plant Monitoring Scheme. It's amazing how much difference that things can make, and even just in terms of recording plant records. In fact, there's a rare moth, the current shoot borer, that I know butterfly conservation are involved in, and one of the new sites that's come up to be surveyed for that species was because it's somebody that walks one of these plant squares, and their records have highlighted an area that has lots of the food plant for this. So if that volunteer hadn't been doing it, we wouldn't have that data to then be conserving this other species. So it just shows the link you can have with that. So that is all our questions. We're just about to go over time, so I'll quickly hand over to Roy just to close us out for the evening. And thank you again, Alistair, and thank you for answering all the questions there. And over to yourself, Roy.
Am I unmuted?
Yes.
Right. Well, I don't know quite how to summarize that. Inspirational springs to mind, I think. It's been great to meet up with Alistair again and find out what he's been up to. And I have to say that he's moved on to such an important job, really. I don't know how many people there are in Plantlife, but it can't be more than a dozen in the whole to do the whole of Scotland. And he's doing it so brilliantly. That was an absolutely clear talk. And I think people can't help but be inspired. Coming back to the questions that were asked about locally, I don't know how many people they're going to be running the SWT next year. It might just be 4 of us, and we just can't do anything. When you talk about these wonderful areas like the Cairngorms, you know, they're massive areas, but we have things locally. For instance, on the Took Hills above Gargunnock is the only site for a moss in the whole of the United Kingdom. We protected it through a planning committee who wanted to afforest the area. and they were forced to leave the area untouched. I guess it's gone because nobody's been up there to manage it. So you can do important conservation work locally. We need people to help, not only run these meetings, but for instance, I've been asked to run talks in the summer, just like somebody asked just now, and I'd love to do that and try and get people to take on board these local projects. But we need somebody with a first aid certificate. So if there's somebody with a first aid certificate, we're not allowed to go out. Our insurance prevents that. Then you could just, if you tagged along, you'd be doing your part. So please get in contact with us if you can. So thank you, Alistair. There are two big problems with Zoom. And for me, they're really important issues. First of all, we should all be able to sit down now and work out how we can contribute to this between us. And that is what we used to do when we had live meetings. And there are a number of projects like hogweed removal, things that came out of meetings. The moth recording came out of a meeting that we do. We would be able to do it. And the other shortcoming is, and it's the worst one, there should now be an enormous round of applause to thank Alistair for a fantastic talk. So I'm sorry you'll be met with absolute silence, Alistair, but really, I hope you can imagine that we all are desperate to say thank you. There's the silence.
Well, thanks for inviting me. It was really nice to to catch up with what's happening and to continue the conversation. Look forward to doing more.
Yeah, well, no, we will definitely touch it. Thank you again very much, Alistair, for doing that and doing all the questions. You had various virtual applauses there. I saw on various screens, and there's a whole list of thank yous and seeing how fantastic the talk is in the chat. I often think the speaker sometimes, unfortunately, gets missed because the talk ends so quickly at the end, but they're there. There's a whole list there. So thank you very much, and thank you everybody for coming along. Please do check out the Plantlife website, and we'll see you again for our next talk on the 5th of March on Scotland's rare butterflies. So thank you again, everybody, and we'll see you again next month.
Oh, can I say something? Am I still online?
Yes, go for it, Roy.
Two other people we need to thank. One is the magnificent job that Stuart does, and Guy, who's been dealing with all the IT this evening. And they really are jobs that frighten me, but thank you both.
Yeah, no problem at all. And thank you again for such a fantastic talk. And we'll see you all again soon. Bye for now, everyone.
Bye.